Why not?
This was the first and now it's good when you get
I noticed. Yeah, we can get started. So, hi everyone, thanks again for coming to our monthly McCaffrey Seminar. Today's presentation is from Mary Baxter on divided waters, oil and gas in the early days of the Great Lakes. Again, we're going to start off with a presentation from Mary, and then we're going to open it up to conversation. Again, the point from the McCaffrey Seminar is to sort of foster conversation and dialectic. We again ask everybody to please be respectful for everything, and if you have questions, just raise your hand and we'll get to it. All yours, Mary.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for coming today. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So as David just mentioned, today I'm talking about the emergence of the offshore oil and gas extraction industry in Lake Erie during the first half of the 20th century, and how interactions between early developers, local populations, and the lake environment forged a niche industry. I'll finish up with some thoughts about what this early activity reveals about past generations' understanding of the lake, of their relationship to fossil fuels, and how this relationship began to change. So that's a whole bunch of stuff. I better get started. The story of offshore extraction in the Great Lakes is a continuation of a movement beginning not so much with the 1850s Lambton County oil strikes, but with an 1889 gas well strike in Essex County that was drilled by Eugene Coste. Coste was a French-trained engineer and former Geological Survey of Canada employee who grew up in Amherstburg. He was the son of Napoleon Coste, a local politician and also an engineer who had worked on the Suez Canal. Coste's strike in Gosfield Township released more than a volume of natural gas. It released a regional desire for a clean, high-energy fuel sourced within Canadian boundaries. Along with hydroelectricity, this fuel came to symbolize an energy independence that became conflated with national identity during a turn-of-the-century tussle with U.S. businesses over the control of Canadian resources. This desire motivated the construction of a pipeline, the Trans-Canada, that was over, I believe it was over 3,500 kilometers long, stretching right across the country. With the rapid commodification of oil and eventual commodification of natural gas, it fueled a belief that the nation could indeed, this belief really fueled the belief that the nation could indeed harness and even overcome its environmental limitations to supply its citizens with a comfortable and prosperous life. Until Coste's strike, Ontarians relied primarily on wood and Appalachian coal to heat their homes and power their industries. The practice of using oil and gas as energy sources did not take hold everywhere at once in Canada when they were found, nor would they fully supplant previous energy sources. Indeed, in some locations where access to natural gas was scarce, companies mixed coal gas and natural gas to provide heat and cooking fuel. Early in the 20th century as well, just to give you an idea of how these technologies all kind of got mixed up with each other, you had steam engines vying with gas-powered internal combustion engines and even electric motors. So they were all supplying different kinds of power. The tremendous volume of oil and natural gas that emerged in Western Canada was a mid-century industry changer, of course, but the Great Lakes Basin was where the oil and gas industry got its start, the commercial industry. So I often call the basin the cradle of commercial oil and gas because it was here that these fuels were first extracted in bulk, and it was here that the modern appetite for their consumption was formed. It was also in this basin that the associated environmental complexities of fossil fuel use began to emerge, as well as the social inequities it fostered. With their common source of origin, you might say that oil and gas are much the same thing at different stages of decomposition. Actually, I'm just going to step back a second just to, talk a little bit about where things emerged. If you do kind of where's Cleveland and Titusville, and you do a V down there, you've got Pittsburgh. So in around this area, we saw a lot of oil and gas strikes. And then over in this area up in here at the same time, there were it was oil industry that got its start first. Then we see the movement of the gas industry. It kind of happens in here. It happens in along the stretch of the U.S. States along Lake Erie, and it also kind of expands and expands. Although I've only shown Lake Erie here, this actually moved up into Lake Huron. And in early years, there were wells drilled, for instance, in Manitoulin Island. So with their common source of origin, you might say that oil and gas are much the same thing at different stages of decomposition. Both fuels are formed from ancient marine organisms that become trapped in sedimentary rock and compressed over the millennia by geothermal activity. That is a very, very small definition of what's going on. I know there's many people in the room that are much more expert than me on this. So how we treat and use the two different fuels, though, is very different. Oil was initially easier to transport because it can be barreled, conveyed by boat, by rail, it can be piped. And because of that ease of transport, it became easier to acquire and to use. Natural gas, on the other hand, initially could only be transported using piping. These transportation characteristics shaped how communities accessed the fuel. Oil, of course, quickly became a mobile commodity that could be consumed anywhere it was shipped. Natural gas's path to commodity had many more steps. At first, it was simply regarded as waste and burned off when it was found, because it was often found in oil wells. In fact, it was necessary to get the oil flow. And then decades later, it became a utility product when it was realized that the fuel could make money if piped to a location with a cluster of users. However, only as the technology advanced enough to allow the gas to travel long distances, and methods were found to keep track of buyers and sellers using the same infrastructure to transport the gas so that they could sell it and deliver it. That's when the transition to commodity became complete for natural gas. But that's far, far ahead of what I'm talking about here today. So back in 1889, as Eugene Cost touted his Gosford Township discovery, residents of southwestern Ontario already envisioned how local piped natural gas might transform their communities. For the past decade, they had heard stories of how the fuel had miraculously cleared the air in industrial Pittsburgh and helped the economy of border cities like Buffalo and Detroit grow. They'd heard stories, too, of dangerous explosions and fields running out, but accounts of rapidly evolving technology and the discovery of new reserves helped to counter these concerns. So I'm just going to move over to show you where that first natural gas strike was. So up there you can see we're right at the northwestern end of Lake Erie. If you're familiar with the area, it's not too far away it's kind of like right in between Leamington and Kingsville, and X marks, well, actually the blue dot marks the spot here. So the first two businesses Cost and his family helped to develop, Ontario Natural Gas Limited and Provincial Gas Natural Gas in Wellington, embraced American investment, most notably Standard Oil, whose interest lay primarily in exporting gas to American cities. So initially, most Canadian gas went across the border. Despite extensive local resistance, it took years to halt these exports, by which point the Essex field, the first field Cost discovered, this field, it was exhausted. Even as the exports ceased, American influence persisted through figures like Henry Doherty, this fellow here, an American engineer who controlled a company by the name, or a group of companies called by City Services. The company controlled much of the gas services in the central United States. In Ontario, Doherty controlled Dominion Natural Gas and the Southern Ontario Gas Company, which that latter company consolidated several regional firms. Among those eventually consolidated was a company called Glenwood Natural Gas, which competed aggressively in Kent County's Tilbury oil and gas field against Union Gas. So Union Gas itself was also a merger of local companies, one of which was controlled by Cost and his brother Denny. So just to orient you onto where this is and what I'm talking about is that's Rondeau. I don't know if you can see, but kind of in this area in here is where all of this stuff was found. The Tilbury fields, they were eventually oil fields, and quickly shifted over as that supply got exhausted. It shifted over to natural gas, and it was one of the biggest reserves of natural gas, and supplied quite a large region around it with the fuel. Union and Glenwood had very different visions. Union wanted to use the field's resources to service local communities. Glenwood, that was headed locally by the Cost brothers' former partner, actually, his name was Harry, I think his last name is Symes. Glenwood wanted to pipe the gas to the larger markets of London, St. Thomas, and Hamilton. By the 1910s, both companies sought to develop offshore wells at Port Alma to meet the mounting industrial and domestic demands of the communities they served. While Union developed single wells under agreement with shoreline owners such as John G. Carr, Glenwood's vision was much, much grander. In 1911, the company obtained a provincial lease for a portion of lake bed stretching 6 miles along the shore. It planned to develop 10 wells connected by a lengthy wharf parallel to the shore. Documentation suggests that Glenwood's first well may have been actually completed in the 1912 season, although it's generally listed as being completed in 1913. The reason why I say that is that there were terms in the provincial lease that they had to meet, which included the company initiating drilling within a year of signing. Offshore drilling was not a novel concept. Oil drillers had operated in Ohio's Grand Lake St. Mary's as early as 1887 and off piers in Santa Barbara by 1896. At Caddo Lake, Louisiana in 1911, the same year Glenwood obtained the provincial license, freestanding oil wells were built into the lake bed. However, there is evidence that suggests offshore gas drilling was actually pioneered on Lake Erie. So what I've got here, pictures, the one on the left is, that's Grand Lake. And then this is Santa Barbara. So provincial records, these are oil, or at least well records, show gas wells near Port Ryerson and off Port Alma. I hope I've pronounced Port Ryerson correctly. As early as 1909. Others have estimated that the first well actually may have appeared, offshore well may have appeared in 1895, and that they would have used gravel to create kind of a spit that they would have dropped the well in at the end of that. A newspaper account from 1913 confirms that the approach the Glenwood development used, which was establishing steel and cement casings that rose above the water, that had already been in use in the eastern end of the lake. What the Glenwood development brought to this already established concept was, of course, a much larger scale of operation. So back to the lake photo, just to orient you again. So this is the area that I'm talking about. I've another well drilled in 1909 by Union Gas. And so and then that's the start of the Glenwood development in 1913. And it's connected to the residence lots that gave them, that they worked with kind of to get the permission to do it. These are very badly photographed plans of what the platform and the apparatus would have actually looked like. So we've got the elevation in this element, and I'm happy to go back in the question period if you have questions, or we can quickly, if you have any questions about what you're seeing here, I might be able to help, might not. Okay. And that is kind of a top down over the far right. There is a top down look. Here is a look at what one of the wharfs that they eventually constructed. So what I've got up here is the picture that was taken. I think this was in the early 1930s. And then below, you can see here how the wells are numbered. And you can pick them off here, and you'll notice that they don't actually correspond, which is kind of interesting. So, especially when we look at something like this, it's really not surprising that Glenwood's Port Alma project may have marked the first really organized resistance to lake bed drilling. Residents initially fought the development in court. John G. Carr, who actually worked with Union Gas to establish that original, I think it may not have been that well, but there was another well that was just adjacent to his property. He argued that because erosion had submerged his former farm fields, he actually maintained the mineral rights in one of the locations where Glenwood planned to drill. And his claim was upheld in 1912 and barred Glenwood from drilling there. Another property owner took a similar claim to court, though, and it was overturned. And it appears other residents and even the township, claiming a roadbed that had fallen into the lake, were not able to similarly prove their offshore mineral rights. So by 1913, tactics shifted. They created a petition to the Minister of Public Works, the Federal Minister of Public Works. It was signed by nearly 250 people, and it argued the development interfered with riparian rights, navigation, fishing activity, and vital fishing grounds. So the Dominion government issued a stop work order, which the company ignored. Simultaneously, municipalities served by Union Gas, including Chatham, Sarnia, and Leamington, objected and wrote motions to this effect, and because they feared the venture would deplete the fields serving their own communities. Water quality concerns also surfaced. Mariner Joseph Wright, Post, noted that the previous waste produced by Ohio refineries and dumped in the lake had been injurious to fish life, and warned that the oily, salty, and sulfurous mineral water brought to the surface would leave the lake in a state of continuous pollution, as it had on the farmland in the district. Indeed, that summer of 1913, residents reported the release of poisonous water into the lake at a rate of 30 barrels per day. The company, Glenwood, countered, claiming its infrastructure sat in shallow, non-navigable waters, and that pound fishing nets were the primary obstruction to lake traffic. So later in that summer, then, federal investigation took place. It was conducted by the district engineer, Mr. Singh, who found the company's infrastructure of a very flimsy character, but he remained unconcerned about the pollution. He also confirmed that the pound fishing nets interfered with the navigation of large boats, although these did not prevent the activities of smaller boats used along the shoreline. So I wanted to give you a picture of what those nets look like. Just, they don't look like much from the surface, but beneath, they're quite extensive. And these things, they extended out like it. There's some accounts, I think, that they might even have gone like a mile out from shore. And so they were quite involved. So Singh, he recommended construction changes to the development, replacing the planned wharf with groins of concrete encased pipelines. And one of the reasons why he suggested this was he wanted to ensure the shoreline access, but he also wanted to address the chronic erosion problem that had been at the crux of the mineral rights dispute. And the project was allowed to proceed. Over the following decades, offshore activity remained steady, but according to well records, at a slow pace. According to Alan Phillips, who may be online today, he's a geologist who's worked in the industry, in the offshore industry in Lake Erie, and who has documented a lot of this history. His research has shown him that from 1913 to 1954, 37 wells were drilled, most of which used wooden platforms. The vast majority of these were located off the shore of Kent County between Port Alma and Wheatley. Companies like Dominion and its subsidiaries seem to prefer leasing Crown land, situating wells away from the shoreline where other claims might exist. In 1917, amid severe gas shortages, Glenwood explored Rondo Provincial Park, hoping to tap the same formation found at Port Alma. So if you know the area, when we were looking at the map, if you just go up a little bit and you'll see a little point and a bay, that's Rondo Provincial Park. Their efforts to find oil or gas were unsuccessful. Nevertheless, this and other more successful ventures reinforced a persistent belief that Great Lakes fields were merely the northern fringe of a massive territory extending into the United States, a theory Eugene Costa championed from the time he first drilled in Essex County, and was the reason why he drilled there. Others seem to be drawn to Crown land, both onshore and off as well. In 1922, a Toronto investor, T.G. Ferris, applied to Indian Affairs for the right to extract oil and gas from the shale at Kettle Point, one of 3 Anishinaabe First Nations communities in the region. Obtaining permission to work directly offshore in Lake Huron was a key, although not the only objective in his correspondence with the department. He wanted to work on land too. The department was required to consult all 3 of the First Nations communities to determine their preferences, and all 3 had to provide a majority vote supporting the activity for the project to proceed. All 3 voted it down. The nations, Kettle and Stony Point and Omnijong, were not necessarily against drilling, but they deeply distrusted the colonial administration that managed their affairs and their land, and with good reason. In a 1905 application to drill at Kettle Point, which did not involve any offshore inquiries, 10 members of the Kettle Point and Stony Point reserves told Indian Affairs that the local Indian agent, Arthur English, had obtained permission through bribery and coercion for the project to go ahead. English denied the charge. The chief at the time, Chief Jacobs, backed his account. Other experiences at the time, such as federal greenlighting of sand mining at Walpole Island on Lake St. Clair, after falsely claiming local approval had been obtained, clearly fed into distrust, nor did the terms of the proposal, of the 1922 proposal, as outlined in correspondence, indicate that the local communities would financially benefit. Efforts to secure offshore rights adjacent to First Nation communities would emerge again in following decades in connection with oil and gas exploration in Lake St. Clair and in submerged lands on Walpole Island. And then also it was also an issue on Manitoulin Island. The next milestone seemingly arrived in 1943 with a well drilled over a mile offshore from Port Alma by Consolidated Western Petroleum. The project's geologist and one of the company's directors was, surprise, E. Frank Cost, Eugene's son. It was not the first freestanding platform to be located so far from shore in North America. A freestanding platform was built a mile out in Louisiana, Louisiana's share of the Gulf of Mexico in 1938. I'm going to have to go back. How do I go back again?
Just push back button should.
Back button should, okay. So this is what construction before the Consolidated West project was put in place. What it looked like, according again to Alan Phillips' research, platform construction indicates that offshore wells in this period were built of wood, and a lot of it was removed before winter so it wouldn't get destroyed by ice, which was a huge problem in drilling in this area. And as you can see here, the construction is clearly wood. Okay, I'm going to see what's after. Nope. All right. Costs. So I'm just cost platform. I got a little bit lost here. Hold on. Oh, I cut something up. Yes. So this is not the first well to be drilled so far from shore in Lake Erie. In 1913, Glenwood drilled a well a similar distance offshore. So that's kind of interesting to me that we've got this story about it all starting in 1943, but clearly it was well before that as well. But Cost's platform, it featured adjustable, dismantleable legs that resembled scaffolding. He took credit for the design of the drilling platform, but it was actually designed by Crum Young Co., a Toronto engineer, and it was built by Ernest Warwick of Blenheim. I'm not sure if the 1943 drilling platform was the one Cost was referring to in a 1954 interview, when he mentioned that his first experiment made out of wood was destroyed by spring ice. I would suspect not. The innovations in Louisiana may have well influenced the platform's design, although so far there's no direct evidence of such connection. There's also a possibility that it was influenced by innovation overseas. Many of those who worked in the oil and gas industry in Ontario had worked overseas at one time or another, such as George Rawlings, one of the principals of Stover and Rawlings, the company that sank Frank Cost's well in 1943. Rawlings had spent time drilling in the tidal flats at the Venezuelan Maracaibo oil field. And a relative of his, Charles, who was also a driller and worked for Dominion, had worked in the California fields. So later versions of the platform used 4 steel piles driven into the lake bed by divers and cables to secure the tower. The setup used a cable tool rig, which attached the drill to a cable that was raised up and down and essentially used percussive force to chisel its way through rock. So the platform that I'm going to show you, this was actually in the 1950s. What first went in 1943 would have been a much, much stripped down version of this. So for instance, you see that that was to house the crews working on drilling. So there were places to sleep, to cook in there. And initially, actually, I think they also had cooks that would come in and do the cooking for them. And then, of course, you can see where the drill's going. You can see how they're transporting this all together, which is they would take all this stuff out, they would assemble it, they would, and then, you know, when they finished drilling the well, then they would remove all this because all you had was deep underwater, actually, with the wellhead. So this would all kind of disappear. The 1943 version was kind of interesting because when they were using it, a storm came up and there was some of the crew members actually got trapped on the platform overnight and they had no shelter and it was extremely windy. So it was quite a frightening experience for them. Connecting these wells to shore involved kind of a sausage, I think of it as a sausage making process of assembling pipes on land and then just flowing them into the lake and kind of hauling them. They'd be dragged into the water, but they would just, you know, they build them on land and then they would just drag them into the water. There's another group apparently, according to Alan, that actually did it in water, but that was what I'm describing was a much more common process that evolved. Divers were heavily relied on, and they worked in murky conditions. Often they identified where they were working or where the well was by gas bubbles. So the valves were left slightly open so that they could actually see the bubbles coming up. It took maybe roughly 6 weeks to complete a well in this way, including setup and takedown. And by 1954, Cost had successfully drilled 12 wells. By this time, the industry was beginning to boom, with many others getting into the game of offshore Great Lakes drilling. Indeed, that same year, drilling branched into Lake St. Clair and toward Lake Huron. All of this activity brought in new players, practices, innovations, and circumstances that generated a fresh set of issues that are just far too extensive for me to get into here today. But I'm just going to touch on some of them in the following discussion. I'm hoping this will go fairly quick. So what did these early years reveal about the industry and our relationship to the lake? So number one, we often view the historical Lake Erie shoreline through a lens of recreation, but in the early 1900s, it was a heavily industrialized zone. Between fishing processing stations, shoreline wells, sand suckers, road builders extracting aggregate, actually very near Port Alma, there was a gravel quarry, and the dikes that protected low-lying farms. The lakeshore was really perceived as a utilitarian space, so offshore extraction can easily be understood as a logical extension of a land-based industry. Community. Not something one often hears about when you're talking about oil and gas. Natural gas and oil development may have had material similarities and shared similar processes of extraction, but how they were used had considerably different impacts on the people who worked in the industry. Both activities built communities, but these took very different forms. Just as oil could be shipped anywhere around the globe, so too could those with the skill sets needed to set up production. The transient communities that were established, first comprised of workers and later of workers and their families, reflected the essentially modern industrial colonizing nature of the global oil industry. Ontario's natural gas industry, on the other hand, fostered deep-rooted communities built on conservative values. In Tilbury and Romney, the townships where this was all happening, where Port Alma was located, companies built homes and schools. Vocation became a generational legacy. This stability produced labor expectations, leading to union formation and labor issues. So there was a lockout in 1955 at Consolidated Western. 11 of 18 workers were locked out. I'm not sure how the dispute got resolved. I do suspect that he broke the union in that case. The industry became as traditional as farming, creating a generational alliance between landowners and extractors. In fishing, the other dominant generational industry in this area, criticism and suspicion of the offshore industry also became entrenched. So you had generations that were just highly suspicious of the oil and gas drilling that was going on offshore. Prioritizing local comfort over environmental impact. Resistance to the offshore industry was rarely environmental in the contemporary sense. Residents did not object to Union Gas's offshore wells because unions served their communities and paid private royalties. Mineral rights, in short, were moneymakers. Residents objected to Dominion because it threatened their energy independence by shipping gas elsewhere. Pollution was tolerated so long as the fuel remained local. Even the documented sulfuric odor and cattle poisoned by industry effluent in streams and municipal drains was all seen as regulatory hurdles to be managed. They were not reasons to halt extraction. Property owners obtained income from hosting these wells, leases and royalties. This financial windfall may well be another reason why the Dominion development was protested, because it took place on Crown land. Suddenly, the Ontario government was competing with landowners for profits. So, The evolution of the environmental priority. As I've mentioned, there were early concerns about turbidity and leaks, but they were secondary to ownership disputes. By the 1950s, as recreation and the need for drinking water grew, pollution moved to the forefront of concerns. These concerns sparked efforts to more closely monitor the industry. So tests were conducted on the impact of natural gas on marine life, finding little long-term impact. It was found, however, that a gas leak could weaken winter ice, which was a hazard to fishermen. Leaks began to be closely monitored and documented by the Ontario Water Resources Commission, which was established in 1956. 2 years later, the commission reported 59 gas leaks from 100 wells in Lake Erie and 4 oil leaks from a very puzzling figure of 101 offshore oil wells. It's puzzling because these wells, they don't appear on the provincial well records. So did they get lost? Was the information inaccurate? It raises a lot of questions about the discrepancies that happen. So, and in fact, with the industry, the industry understanding was that there was always only one oil well offshore, and that was in Colchester in Essex County. So by 1961, the commission had reported four more wells leaking gas in Lake St. Clair and Erie, and suspected there were more. The frequency of these leaks appear to have not been disclosed to Great Lakes states when they inquired, or even to the Ontario public. Of mounting concern was the impact on water quality. In the 1950s, that access to drinking water declined in the deep southwest, where the commercial natural gas industry first took root. In Essex County, residents in Leamington and Harrow resorted to buying drinking water because the salt, sulfur, and iron was contaminating their wells, which would likely have a great connection to the natural gas drilling that had gone on in that area. So drawing directly on the Great Lakes was a solution for these communities to get that drinking water, and it was increasingly the same solution for nearby Michigan communities like Detroit and Flint, and for other locations in the midst of the industry, such as Sarnia. So worries about oil spills drove protests, with the concern being, of course, that if gas wells commonly leaked, what did that imply about oil wells or gas wells that inadvertently struck oil? By the late 1950s, residents in municipalities in Ontario and Michigan would join fishing associations to protest the offshore industry expansion to Lake St. Clair and Lake Huron. They succeeded in halting these developments, although the decision would be reconsidered in following decades. The protests would also prompt the Ontario government to review its approach to regulating the industry, ushering in a decade of increasingly tighter control and scrutiny, not only from Ontario, but from Great Lakes states and from the federal government. So, last point here. American interests featured prominently in earlier stages of the oil and gas industry in Ontario. The level of exploitation of Ontario energy resources had generated resentment and eventually closed the border to natural gas exports. Yet the resentments remained prominent enough to be used, even though that situation was addressed, they were still prominent enough to be used as a way to build resentment about the Dominion venture. The idea of energy independence also became regionalized, with concerns about exporting natural gas beyond the current service area, not just across the states, but just beyond that current service area, sparking concern. Nevertheless, and beneath this current of resentment, an exchange of technical information and expertise continued, facilitated likely in part by the experiences of international drillers and other field workers returning to Ontario's oil and gas fields. American ownership of companies such as Dominion and Standard-owned Imperial Oil would have further facilitated information exchanges within company networks. Drillers venturing out into Lake Erie would have been well aware of what was happening in the industry in the south and western areas of the United States and elsewhere. The Lake Erie offshore drilling then became one of the many nodes that mutually shaped an industry which straddled borders. So geologically as well, the strikes of oil in the lakes reinforced the idea that the industry knew no borders. As activity advanced deeper in the lake, it confirmed long-standing theories that there was a link between the fields in Ontario and those in Ohio. This offshore activity then advanced knowledge of the industry in a meaningful, if subtle ideological way, which also facilitated the exchange of information and techniques that would attract, by the 1950s, more companies controlled by international interests, and by the 1970s, encourage Canadian companies' interest in applying their skill in American waters of the Great Lakes. That's it.
There's a bunch of people online. I'm gonna come up to Bruce and briefing. We're gonna open up to questions now for Mary. For everybody online who can hear me, I hope. We're gonna try and unmute you and see if it works, so you can actually just ask your question. So who wants to go first? We'll go with R. We'll ask you to unmute yourself and you can go from there. Maybe. We'll go. No, sorry, I just lowered somebody's hand. MBMOI. Give it a shot. We'll see if we can hear you.
Thanks. It's Michael Moyer, and just want to congratulate Mary on an excellent presentation. Enjoyed it very much. And my question for you was whether or not there was technology available to remediate the spills. Your research has indicated that the spills were being recorded, and was anything done to actually deal with the oil that was, I assume, washing up on the beach?
In the early period, not so much, Michael. I guess they just lived with it. I'm making a guess on that. But as time moved on, especially in the 1960s, oil leaks, of course, became of great concern, and the International Joint Commission became involved, and they started to develop a strategy to address the situation. By the late 1960s, it was realized that there was no emergency strategy on the Great Lakes on how to handle an environmental situation like an oil spill.
We'll go on for Joe. You can unmute yourself.
Once I get my thumbs working. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Mary. That was like super, super interesting. And my question follows on a little bit of an intersection between things I'm working on and what you're doing. Not oil and gas, though, but my question is just a simple fact question from your setup, your background part of your talk. And you refer to a federal investigation about obstruction to navigation by a federal inspector by the name of Singh. And I'm just wondering if you could, I missed the date, and I'm not clear on the spelling of his name, and that might be useful for me as a tip. So I'm wondering if you can fill that in.
Mr. Singh, I do not know his first name, but Singh is like sing a song.
Okay.
And it was in 1913, the summer of 1913.
Summer of 1913. Super. Thank you ever so much.
All right, I got Mike Dove up next, unless there's anybody in the room. Split it. 3, 2, 1. No, Mike.
Hey folks, can you hear me?
Ish.
Okay, it's a little bit echoey, but here goes. Thanks very much. Mary, really enjoyed that. I'm afraid I don't know a whole lot about the drilling and the exploration that was going on in the Great Lakes. My knowledge is based more in Lambton County in late 19th and through the 20th century. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. I had a question. I don't think I missed it. In terms of what was happening in, say, Lake Michigan, I know they had been doing the directional drilling. That's what took place out there. Um, the influence either way, I guess, was there some sort of impact on decisions that were being made in Lake Erie to what was happening in Lake Michigan? I know they do the directional drilling, so it's from onshore. Were there offshore wells in Lake Michigan? Why or why not? And in terms of the environmental hazards that were involved there, did anything happen in Lake Michigan that might have happened or might have influenced what happened in Lake Erie or vice versa in terms of the decision making around that?
Mike, I might be able to better answer your question but when I have a visit planned, I'm hoping to get to the state archives in Michigan. So at this point, I don't know much about the history there. I think that there were maybe a couple of wells that were drilled there, but certainly what I do know a little of is that the concern over what was happening in Lake Erie, Michigan residents were terribly concerned, raised a lot of issues, were quite vocal with the situation, and that when this whole idea of drilling in the Great Lakes was revisited in the 1970s and 1980s, Michigan just said no.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. I don't see any other hands in the Zoom link. Does anybody hear?
Yeah, you showed a slide where you had a plan and some maps. I'm just wondering what your source where you found those maps and if there were many more of them.
Library and Archives Canada. Yeah, they are a good resource. They have a whole file on two files actually that are thick on the whole Glenwood situation.
Okay.
I've got Scott coming in next.
Yeah, hi. I'm just curious. You had mentioned that oil exploration had happened on Lake Erie, and I was just wondering if you had any data or whatever that kind of, from when to when and how many.
Mike, this is the big mystery, and especially with the Ontario Water Resources Commission 1958 report, which was based on other, I think it was the Ministry of Mines or might have been Energy at that point. Anyway, it was somebody who knew those records, had supplied them, and said that there are 101 oil wells offshore in Lake Erie, 80 of which were in Kent County. So I don't know if this was a statistic was likely a long stretch. So from the beginning of this activity to 1958 is my suspicion. And so that my guess is that those wells came in before the 1920s. Which was a time when these records weren't kept. There was legislation that was passed in the 1920s that required well records to be kept in Ontario. So there's obviously a lot more work to be done on what's going on there, and to figure that out. But then, of course, there were some strikes, especially in the Western Basin, where they struck oil because there's a lot of oil in Erie's Western Basin. And then certainly plans going and moving into Lake Huron, and also there were oil wells in Lake St. Clair, and the plans in developing Lake Huron included oil development.
Is there a I guess a documented record of the locations of these places?
Yeah, so one of the resources that I have found to be an excellent resource are the provincial well data and the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, where they've actually mapped the locations of a lot of these wells. So that's a very, very friendly way to look into a lot of this information.
Okay. Thank you.
Questions, maybe I too, but the first quick one, was there operations on Lake Huron, or it was just plans to and those got?
They actually set up and they were going to do it, and they did drill, I think, some exploratory wells to determine. But then the protests became so much that they shut everything down.
So it didn't materialize. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. And then my second question, a little more qualitative, but just interested in your own background and what drew you towards studying the history of petroleum in relation to the Great Lakes.
So my background is that I've worked in journalism for a number of years, and I've worked in the particularly in Ontario's Southwest region. Most of my career has been spent here, and I wanted to, when I was returning to school, I wanted to do something that I felt was I could really contribute. And I mean, I love the Great Lakes. I've lived here for most of my life, and I thought, okay, we have to start looking at the history of the Great Lakes more. So that's initially what motivated me. I knew that a lot of people didn't know anything about this activity. So I thought, well, somebody's got to look into it.
I have Christina coming in next.
So my question refers to your comments about royalties. So the provincial government earned all the royalties off the offshores. Who was gaining royalties or taxation for the onshore wells that were near in those Essex counties?
Property owners.
So property owners were the only
riparian
royal.
rights, I would believe. So
So
this was the whole issue with what happened with the proposal at Port Alma with Glenwood's development, because it was in the Union Gas developments were actually in the waters that were controlled by property owners. So the money that went for leasing and those royalties actually would have gone to the property owners. What happened frequently was that the companies simply bought out the property owners.
So a couple of hands in here.
Yeah, so I'm really interested. I don't know anything about this. I was going to ask, was it a lot easier to get funding or a sponsorship, to actually fund these ideas on land, or was it were people more likely to do exploration in the lake?
Lake exploration was driven by a couple of factors. One, I mean, well, more than a couple. First off, there was an overwhelming desire generally for natural gas because people just so valued that fuel. When it started, there were shortages at times, and then it eventually kind of like ran out on shore or on land. So they wanted to keep moving south because they knew that this was they suspected this was all a part of the same reserve. And the closer that they could get to the States with it, the more that they could get. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Or I asked an idiot question.
No, it wasn't. It was cheaper to drill on land.
Yeah,
Yeah, much cheaper.
I think Mike's got another question.
Thank you. It was asked earlier about the engineer by the name of Singh. His initials were JG, and I believe he worked for the Department of Public Works for a time, but he was also the consulting engineer for the Toronto Harbour Commission in 1912, 1913, when they were developing their waterfront development plan that led to the large-scale reclamation of Ashbridges Bay, which at the time was the largest marshlands in eastern Canada. And he also was a consulting engineer to the City of Toronto on a major report about the quality of drinking water that was taken in from Lake Ontario. My question, Mary, is how do you decide where to drill in a lake? I have having trouble struggling with how you stand on shore and you look out over all that water and think, yes, I'm going to put a drill right there and see if we strike oil. It seems like a bit of a long shot. Do they have any rhyme or reason behind this?
Today, they certainly have evolved methods to be able to figure out where to drill, and it involves geologists' knowledge. From what I understand from Alan Phillips, the way that they do it now, of course, would have been very different from back then. I think back then it really was more a sense of There was some general sense of where this stuff was located. Geologists were able to locate that. People would sink wells. They go, oh, look what we found. And then because they had this suspicion that the field extended beneath the lake bed and into the States, they thought, well, if we drill here, maybe we'll get more. So they got more and more refined over time as the understanding of geology developed, as different techniques to be able to measure where things were developed. But this period, it was before a lot of that.
I see you, Dan. I'm just gonna double check because I think there was somebody in here, so we're first.
Thanks, Mary. My question was about, you made the point towards the end, called it oil, gas, and community, and that, so, oil can be put in barrels, gas has to be piped. And so was your argument that, because gas has to be piped, that the gas industry develops in a more sort of local, you said community-centered way, as opposed to a kind of national consolidated oil industry. That's really interesting to me if it's true, but I could also see the argument that, well, that makes the gas industry even more capital intensive. And so, yeah, is there a sort of, in terms of consolidation and ownership, does the businesses develop differently because of this technical difference?
I can speak to what happened in this point in southwestern Ontario. Did this expand to other locations? Because at the same point in time that we're talking about in the States, for instance, they were starting to transport gas really long distances. And so the crews, one wonders that, were crews kind of more transient because of that, because they were building the pipelines and building them to different places. But definitely in this instance, after pouring through many company newsletters with Union Gas, you can really see how the communities, both at Port Elma, which was more a Union Gas company town, and at Glenwood, which was more the Dominion town, both of those communities, they really started to build up, and it's the same people. You see the names that go through the generations there.
So where were the pipelines? Like on this map, how far are the pipes going?
So the pipelines in the early years, they would have gone as right up to like Sarnia, for instance, over to Chatham, over to Windsor. So that is kind of the breadth of the network that Union was covering at this time. Dominion was having its eye. There were other pipe networks over in the Niagara Peninsula that were built to supply Hamilton, for instance. They weren't necessarily connected at this point in time, but of course, as time continued, connections were made. And that's kind of out of the scope of the time period that I'm talking about.
All right, Dan.
Hi there. Hopefully folks can hear me.
Yep.
Yes, no?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. So I come to this with a handful of perspectives. I grew up on Lake Erie in Ohio, and I am a geologist, and I do work in the oil and gas industry. So specifically, my question on this map is, are the gray dots, are those natural gas wells versus blue dots being oil wells? Or are those gray dots wells that were like permitted and never drilled or something like that?
Thanks very much for your question. The way that this map has been constructed is that kind of all of the wells that ever existed that they have recorded are on it. And if they're not kind of in play at a certain time period, then they're grayed out, or if they're a different kind of well, they're grayed out. So I think when I selected for this, I selected for gas show and natural gas producing wells.
Oh, okay.
And oil.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I do know that there's been we'll say a modern history of natural gas exploration in the Canadian side of Lake Erie. When you mentioned Michigan saying no offshore, I believe Ohio and Pennsylvania did the same thing at the same time, basically. And so there's very little drilled in the U.S. side of Lake Erie. And as I understand it, if you wanted to drill a well offshore today in Canada, if you had any oil production at all, you would have to plug the well. That you're allowed natural gas production, but no oil production. And so folks, we're talking about some of the environmental side of things. Part of the way they looked at regulating the potential for an oil spill is to not allow oil production. Obviously, if you have a natural gas issue, if it's lit, you could have an explosion. But if it's a natural gas pipe leaking or broken or whatever, it's just emitting natural gas through the water column, which happens every time something dies and lands on the bottom of the lake also. That you have natural gas emitting from the bottom. So anyhow, just a couple thoughts.
Yes, certainly. You're quite right about that. That came in with the IJC becoming involved and policy changes that required that only gaseous form of natural gas, I believe, was allowed to be produced in the lake to prevent oil spills or other harmful elements getting into the water. To your other point, Pennsylvania actually did allow drilling at one point, and I think that there were 3 wells that were drilled, but they came up dry.
All right.
Yeah, I knew it was very minimal though, activity on the US side.
Any other questions in here? That I got other than there. So I will say thank you very, very much to Mary and everybody who participated. And obviously, have any questions? That's fair. Thanks, everyone.